why have I been invited here? Well, VCS started out life as the Victorian Cytology Service. We've been around for 50 years as a pap smear laboratory established by our Cancer Council and Department of Health in Victoria. About 25 years ago, Heather Mitchell, a public health professional and epidemiologist working at VCS as the Deputy Director, led the establishment of Australia's first pap test register, which has been incredibly important in understanding how our program is performing and how we can improve it. So we now have made some changes to our organisation because we're no longer just Victorian, and we're certainly no longer just cytology, as you'll see. And so we've got a new structure. Our long-standing laboratory continues. We have VCS Population Health that has that public health expertise, and VCS Digital Health that importantly underpins all the work that our population health and pathology programs do with a specialised IT team. And some of our programmers are young guys that come to us from university and pretty quickly know more about cervical screening than many GPs. So that multidisciplinary approach to control of this cancer is the heart of our organisation. We're in exciting times because essentially we know how to control cervix cancer as a public health problem globally. We know how to do this, and the challenge now is to roll it out. So the WHO has actually called for elimination of cervical cancer as a public health problem at the May World Health Assembly this year. The actual targets haven't been set yet in terms of what the elimination threshold will be, in terms of incidence and the time at which that is expected or we can aim to achieve this. And of course there's a lot of work going on to resolve the tension between a target that's both motivating and also realistic. But the opportunity that this presents for all of us in this room who care about this cancer is it brings cervical cancer up the priority list for governments around the world and health ministers. And of course, to achieve this, we need the right resourcing. You can't do this on the smell of an oily rag, as we've been hearing. And so what am I going to talk about? I want to talk a little bit about how we have succeeded in controlling cervical cancer to the extent that we have in Australia, how we got there, a little bit of a reflection on how we do auditing to the extent that we do and cytology rescreens, why we've decided to move ahead with HPV primary screening, which is a fantastic opportunity, what have been the challenges of that implementation, and a program that's been running for nearly 30 years stably and successfully, having a monumental change like this is very, very hard to change. It has inertia, and I did say 10 years ago, it's going to be like turning around a frigate. It's been very complex and not everything has gone perfectly, but no doubt we will continue to improve the performance of our program, and ultimately that's our goal. And what can other countries learn from our experience? So here is our incidence of cervical cancer, and we commenced in 1991. We've had steady declines until about 2000, and now we've reached a level where we're not improving anymore with cytology-based screening. Importantly, all of these gains have come through control of the main cancer of the cervix, squamous cell carcinoma of the cervix, and even in Australia, where we have very low incidence and mortality rates now, we've done nothing to impact control of adenocarcinoma of the cervix. This is a cancer where, as a cytopathologist, I can tell you that it's harder to identify the precursors. For the smear takers, it's harder to get those cells onto the slide. And despite the fact that we've educated people about the appearance of the precancerous lesion, we've tried everything. As you can see, at a population level, we haven't done anything to impact that cancer. Australia is a federation of 8 states and territories, and we're deeply competitive, and it brings its own pluses and minuses. And it's very hard to change our screening programs in Australia because they're nationally set through consensus agreements with 8 states and territories. That's 8 state and territory ministers and a federal minister who have to agree that you're going to change something. So we've had a very stable program for a long time. Victoria, where I am from, is a state of about 6 million people, so not a dissimilar size to Ireland, slightly bigger. We're very proud that our incidence is amongst the lowest, certainly the lowest in Australia and amongst the lowest globally. Our mortality there is 1 per 100,000. That's the really important number, and that's half our national mortality. So we say that we're preventing additional 50 women from dying of this cancer each year because the systems and processes are as optimised as they can be. But we are still not preventing every cancer and not every cancer death. The national program was an organised program, commenced in 1991, and we've had 2 yearly PAPs offered to women aged 18 to 69 years. That 2 yearly interval ultimately was a political compromise between the public health bodies that wanted a 3 yearly program, as the international evidence suggested, and the clinical groups were adamant that we had to have annual screening. So we're one of the few countries in the world that does screening every 2 years, or did screening every 2 years. The 3 key things that I think have led to our success have been health promotion activities aimed at maximising participation. State and territory PAP test registers have been very active in a range of roles, importantly ensuring follow-up and providing a rich source of data for improvement of the program, and laboratory regulation underpinning quality assurance and quality improvement. So as you can see, we've had participation which at the 2-year recommended interval is lower than you would want. Fortunately for us, cervical screening with cytology is effective every 3 years, and more women do participate on that basis. If you go out to 5 years, which is going to be our new interval, we're up to around 80% participation. So that is very pleasing. What you will see is that as women get older, they're not coming into the program as often, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So these are data from our Victorian Cervical Screening Register, and what that's showing you in the blue and the orange are the women that have been followed up after high-grade abnormalities as a percentage within 6 to 9 months. And personally, I believe that this has been a very, very important metric in keeping high, leading to our very, very low mortality. No point in doing great screening and doing great tests and with great participation if you don't actually follow up the women that you're identifying. And we don't see these high rates of follow-up in other jurisdictions necessarily. Our laboratory accreditation in our previous PAP program was structured in a way that you need to have this accreditation to bill the government for payment. We have a fee-for-service basis for our funding. And we had 2 documents that we had to comply with. The one on the left, requirements for gynecologic cytology, I would classify as being a set of requirements about the processes you have to have in a lab to do quality work. Things like, are you accessioning the cases properly? Are you identifying things, etc. The performance measures on the right, these are measures of our detection rate, as you will see, of our PPV and other measures. And these are what I would call outcomes. They're laboratory outcomes, they're not patient outcomes. So this is how we know how the labs individually are performing, and these are the measures we have to meet to maintain our accreditation. If the lab doesn't meet these measures, which happens from time to time, there then needs to be an investigation to unpack that and see whether what we're talking about is underperformance, what corrective action is needed, and ultimately a couple of labs have lost their ability to continue to bill government for their services. So importantly, Dr. Heather Mitchell, who established the registry and was very important, she was the deputy director when I came in as the director, and it was actually humbling to be in that role with Heather, because she was a very quiet, very effective person, really committed to getting the right structures in place from a public health program. And she said to me, the thing we want with these performance measures is a couple of strategically targeted measures. Because if you have 20 measures for a laboratory and the important ones aren't being met, they can hide behind the 17 or 18 out of 20 that they are meeting. And some countries look at what are your candida detection rates or trichomonas. Well, that's not the point of pap smears. And so I'll draw your attention to the second and third. Our high-grade detection rate being what we call ASK-H, so that what we call possible high-grade, and high-SIL must be greater than 0.7%, and that's an age standardised rate. And our positive predictive value for HSIL must be greater than 65%, and for ASK-H must be between 40 and 65%. Together, those measures give us a good indication that a laboratory is finding the right number of abnormalities. Now, over the years, we've had labs that have claimed they have particular patient groups that mean they can't find as much high-grade disease, and the ones that have not succeeded are the ones that have invested in the legal process. The labs that actually invest in the teaching and training over time have been able to get their detection rates up, and I have never seen a substantiated case of a different population. So that's something people often say, but it's never been substantiated. So audit and rescreen are interesting because they're not, in some ways, an integrated part of our screening program, and that's possibly a gap. When I started overseeing the register in my role, I was aware that other countries were doing cancer audits, and I felt that in Victoria we should do as much as we could. What had happened historically is in 1994 we had a very high-profile legal case that went in front of the courts and led to a lot of reform in the way we do things. And at the time there was discussion about potentially having cancer audits in Australia, and there was never agreement between the College of Pathology that were calling for an indemnity if they were going to do these audits and the government. And so the audits never happened. But when you think about it, the look back of the slides is the very last bit of the audit. And so what we started doing in our annual statistical report that we do from our cervical screening register that gives us a rich source of data each year and enables us to monitor and evaluate the program, is that we decided that we would publish the aggregated data related to the screening history of women developing cancer in Victoria. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that in our program we regard the detection of microinvasive cancer, sometimes called superficially invasive cancer, as a screening success. These women are likely to be, well, they have the same outcomes as women with CIN3. They're treated with a gynecologic procedure, and while technically they have a cancer, they're generally not in oncology wards. So given those outcomes, we generally separate those off, and we're looking at the frankly invasive cancers. Secondly, we do like to look at invasive squamous cancer because we know we are not preventing adenocarcinoma. We'd like to, but realistically we know we're not getting there. So I just want to draw your attention to, sorry, I just got to find the laser pointer. So amongst women with invasive squamous cell cancer, we know that 80% of these women are either never screened or they're not up to date with screening. And that's not to criticise the women. It means something about our screening program is not working for them. And we've got to concentrate on what that is. So inside a program that has very low rates, that can hide disparity. And as you'll see, that's what we concentrate on now, is reducing disparities. Down here in our very successful program, you see the cases that potentially you'd look back on. There's a very small number, but it's not zero. So unfortunately, we haven't ever been able to get that number down to zero. So this comes to what Lorraine was talking about and what I was trying to unpack as I read the Scully report in full on my way over here. And that is, I think we have an excellent program. We don't want perfect, the unattainable perfect, to be the enemy of excellent. But where is this boundary in a program in general or for a particular case in particular? And how do you determine that in a fair way and in a realistic way? So I'm just putting up these cells to show you that on the left you have a high-grade lesion there, and on the right you have normal parabasal cells. Now to me that's quite a straightforward distinction, but they are quite difficult to look at, and these are the ones that, as you saw, you have the exact same thing in mammography, that there are misses that are, how did I miss that? And there are some that have overlapping appearances that you think, hindsight bias, was that actually a lesion, or was that parabasal cells that I'm looking at in a woman I now know has developed cancer? So these are very, very difficult distinctions to make as a cytopathologist as you look at the cases, whether it's yours or someone else's. And I also want to bring to your attention this very old data now from something called the ALTS trial. It was a big clinical trial looking at ASCUS and low-grade cytology carried out in North America. And there, as you see, they're looking at agreement between the first read in the field and the expert read. And whilst there are high levels of agreement, by no means is there 100% agreement. So there is this inter-observer variability in looking at cytology, which, although a science and we train people, has an art component to it and an experience component as well. So we've been involved in doing some cytology look-backs, partly for a process that happened in New Zealand called the Unfortunate Experiment, and some of you may know of that. And in reading the Scully report, I did feel that I'd heard a story with the same themes before, and this goes back several decades, but also in some legal cases where we've been asked to provide expert advice. And our preferred methodology, given that that hindsight bias is so difficult to take out of your mind once you know, and we try very hard to do it, but it's just because of the subtlety of what we're looking at, very, very difficult to be completely, to look at a slide fresh as if it was in front of you for the first time. So the way we do this is that we try to recreate. What we're trying to say is this negligence? Is this something that should have been found and is usually found, or is this actually a difficult case? That's what we're trying to test for the lawyers. And what we do is we take the number of cases that we expect a scientist to screen in a day, and we get the index slide, and we get slides from the same laboratory with the same marking, women of a similar age, and we then record all the markings. In the old days, we used to do this by laying all the slides on a Xerox machine and just Xeroxing the slides. We'd record the markings and take everything off, because that's how screening's done. You start with a blank slide with no markings. And those slides are then screened, those 50 slides, in a usual workload is screened by a single scientist in a day. The scientist then only refers to a pathologist, those cases that they would normally, in the normal conduct of their work. Now, we do this with 6 to 10 scientist-pathologist pairs, and what we're asking is the index slide one where a lesion was identified by all or almost all of the teams, or is it one that maybe one or two people said, I'm not sure if there's something there? So what we're trying to get a handle on then when I write my advice to the solicitors is whether or not this is a slide that should have been identified in the normal course of events. So look-backs of single slides where you know the history, it's just almost impossible to get rid of that hindsight bias, as much as we'd love to do that. There's a lot of literature about this because of the litigation that happened in North America in the late 80s and early 90s, a very famous Wall Street Journal article that triggered all of that activity and led to clear regulation. But I'm ashamed to say that there were colleagues of mine, people who were famous and wrote textbooks, mentors, who made a lot of money out of being guns for hire on either side. And you always knew what they were going to say about a slide, because they always either acted for the plaintiff or for the defence and predictably made a case one way or the other. We want to be fair in these reviews. We want to try and bring as maximal fairness to what we think is going on. So that's the way we've done reviews in our lab when they have come up, and locally in Australia and in Australasia, for a variety of reasons, we often get the opportunity to do rescreens like that. So I'm going to turn quickly and talk to what we call renewal of the cervical screening program, and that was a term that a very dear colleague, Andriana Kakuri, came up with, because at the time we were doing this, the breast screen program was going through a lot of pain following a review, and the word review had connotations that there was something wrong. Sadly, after a long illness with bowel cancer, Andriana died a couple of months ago, and that's very distressing. So why did we do this? As I've shown you, our program with cytology is reaching its limits, and we then had a plateau phase. And that's the first thing. The second thing is, as has been alluded to, we've had a very early and extensive HPV vaccination program. And by extensive, I mean we probably remain one of the programs that has funded vaccination to the oldest ages. So we had catch up to the age of 26. And we've had enormous success with this program. Partly our participation has been very high, but we've got a variety of publications that demonstrate the impact, and we've had relatively good control, knock on wood, it can happen anywhere, of the anti-vaxxer misinformation situation. And this has played out into a reduction in the high-grade histology that we are seeing, that our national and state reporting is seeing. And in 2011, we were the first in the world to report this decline in precancerous abnormalities amongst the vaccinated cohort. That was ecological evidence, so it was a correlation, and we didn't say it was causation, but we were subsequently able to data link our vaccine register with our screening register and show a very good correlation. What this means in terms of screening is same haystack, fewer needles, so lower prevalence means that our positive predictive values and other metrics of screening are going to become more challenging. So how did we look at this? We took a very strong, or the Australian government took a very strong evidence-based approach. There was a comprehensive systematic review of the relevant literature, and modelling was also performed. Now, modelling is commonly performed for cost-effectiveness analysis, but also modelling had to be performed because at the time there was not empirical evidence about how screening would work in vaccinated young women, and still there isn't. And there was also not empirical evidence about the performance of the newer tests, particularly those that allowed us to partially genotype and find the worst or the nastiest of the HPV viruses. These are cost-effectiveness plans which, you know, I'm a cytopathologist, but I've had to learn to understand. And typically, you're operating in the top right-hand quadrant, and the question in front of a health technology assessment, a committee, or a minister is the increasing life years saved or quality-adjusted life years saved on the x-axis worth the increased costs? Are they above and below an arbitrary willingness to pay threshold? Is the extra health benefit worth the extra expenditure? So we undertook, with the literature review and with Karen Canfell and the modelling team at Cancer Council New South Wales, an evaluation of about 132 different programs, and they were broadly continuing with cytology but using liquid-based cytology, which we weren't using HPV as a co-test, using primary HPV, and with or without genotyping. And we made the most optimistic assumptions for the performance of LBC and the harshest assumptions about the performance of HPV that we could get from the literature. And the first thing is, when you look at this, is that we're in a different quadrant. So if you look at the orange circles, which are all the HPV-based screening programs with different screening, different starting and finishing ages and different assumptions about workup and so on, all of them give us better health than current practice at a lower spend. And that lower spend comes because you can screen more effectively every 5 years with an HPV test than you can every 2 or 3 years with cytology. I have never seen that ever in any health technology assessment. The solid circles are those strategies that used partial genotyping as part of the algorithm. So in short, this is what we've come up with. If HPV is not detected, we issue a report that tells the woman she's at low risk of a significant cervical abnormality, and that language is very deliberately chosen to convey that is not zero risk, and these women are recalled at 5 years. If HPV 16 or 18 are found, these are the most cancer-causing of the HPV viruses. They cause 70, nearly 80% in Australia of our cancers. Women are destined for colposcopy, but they do have LBC on that pathway just to inform the colposcopist. In the middle, the other HPV types, we do reflex cytology, and we refer immediately to colposcopy at a threshold of high-grade disease at that point. Which is a little bit different to the international convention of any cytologic abnormality. But after all, if we know you've got HPV, we're not surprised to see low-grade cytology because that is the manifestation of an HPV infection. And if we know you haven't got one of the ones that causes cancer quickly, we were comfortable with that. We've been repeating our low-grade cytology after a year in Australia, not knowing which HPV type the woman was carrying for a long time with a high degree of safety. So what's gone well? The policy decision, we believe, has been evidence-based, and even the very conservative US Preventative Task Force has also recently issued guidance accepting that HPV screening every 5 years is acceptable. We expect a further 30% reduction in incidence and mortality from this cancer, and that's why we come to work. screening with an HPV test gives us a wealth of data about the performance of our vaccination program, and that's been very exciting too. So this is a modelled analysis that Karen Canfeld's team led. I was privileged to be involved in that. And part of the reason, one of the things we do have to manage quite carefully in our program, because there were many who wanted co-testing, not just HPV testing, is when you use a more sensitive test, we're going to bring forward the diagnosis of a number of cancers in the community, and that's a good thing because that will downstage them. But when you look at your incidence data, you're going to see incidence transiently go up. So we needed to have predicted this, because I can tell you people who oppose the current screening program would otherwise jump on it and say it's proof that it's not working. After that transient increase, you see this very substantial decline, and if the WHO indicates that the elimination threshold is 4 per 100,000, we'll be there, we're predicting, in 2035, which is very exciting. We see these patterns for high-grade lesions, for cancers, but for mortality, because what we're doing is moving forward, we are not anticipating a transient increase in mortality. So mortality will start trending down immediately. Implementation has had its issues. One of them has been an underestimation of the complexity of the underpinning IT systems that are so important in providing the data our screening programs need. They make sure that women with abnormalities progress through to treatment with a system of reminders and correspondence with practitioners and with women themselves, and ultimately with a high-grade lesion where we can't find the woman, with access to latest mail addresses from the Australian government. This has led to delays in the implementation of our HPV program. The government decided that 8 state and territory registers would be brought into one and combined with the infrastructure supporting the bowel screening program, and went to tender. And you couldn't disagree with that as a policy process. An agreement was signed with Telstra Health, who won that bid, and go-live dates were announced. We were to have had our bowel screen register updated in March last year, and our cervical cancer screening register function ready in May last year to go live. But in February last year, as many of the labs had already started making redundancy decisions and giving people payouts and making that planning happening with the date of the 1st of May to the first program, the government announced that the platform wasn't going to be ready in time and pushed out the start of our program until December 2017. The Australian National Audit Office went through a process of looking at the procurement and the contract management that's not totally pretty. Our program went live without completion of the functionality, but with a functionality nationally to collect results from the new program. But we had to get our screening history as labs from the legacy state and territory registers. We've been operating the Victorian register in contingency mode throughout this process, but it's not the same in every state and territory. We were expecting the cervical functionality to be fully up and running in June. Not quite there yet, not sure when it's going to be there, and we're not sure at all when the bowel screen program is going to come out. So that has been a difficult process to watch, and to be completely transparent with you, we competed in that tender process and came second, which is the worst place to come, right? Because you have all the expense and none of the opportunity. I've got like 3 left. There was a lot of media attention, and it has caused some confusion, and women don't understand the difference between this project and the program itself. And this has an impact. This has had an impact both in England and in Australia, and the message is understanding the complexity that's involved in this change. I won't go through self-collection except to say that this is going to be an opportunity that's going to help us break through and reach women who will not have a speculum put in, and these are the women we're not serving. I can see we're under time. The acceptability of self-sampling is fantastic. Women love it. and we have to be sure that elimination is for all Australian women and all women globally, and that we address inequity. So implementation of primary screening has given us an opportunity to improve the effectiveness, and this can happen in every country. It needs careful planning and strategic leadership, and public health people have to be front and centre there. We've in both countries underestimated the complexity of registers. Self-sampling is so important to reach the women we're not reaching yet. So doing the right thing isn't always easy. This is what renewal of the program means in my lab. We lost 40 scientists. We have to handle that with compassion, but it's not a reason not to update and give women the best program. We've got to always put women at the front of all the decisions we make, even when it's challenging and uncomfortable for the supporting health services. Thank you very much.